In 1986, Sherri Rae Rasmussen was 29 years old, living in a condominium with her new husband of 3 months, John Rutan. In a few short minutes, though, her new, charmed life ended in a vicious, brutal murder that would go unsolved for over 20 years. On the night of February 24, her husband came home to discover his new bride, who had stayed home from work that day after injuring her back doing aerobics, bloodied, beaten, and dead from numerous gunshot wounds to the chest. But with the help of advancing technology, the Los Angeles Police Department's cold case squad cracked a case as dramatic as any on television. After running a DNA test on a bite mark on Rasmussen's body, they confronted a new and shocking likelihood. The perpetrator was one of their own, Officer Ilene LAZARUS. At Rasmussen's murder, Lazarus had only been on the force for 2 years as a patrol officer. In her career, she became involved with the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program as a training officer and visited her former junior high school. She served as a treasurer for the Los Angeles Women Police Officers Association for 5 years. She helped fundraise to provide reliable, round-the-clock childcare for parents who worked on the force. At one point, she'd even started her own private investigation company, Unique Investigations. After over 20 years on the force, she'd been promoted to the high-profile, high-stakes art theft detail, which tracked stolen art and art forgeries. In April 2009, she was featured with her department, Don Reichik, in LA Weekly's annual LA People issue. She told the paper that working the art beat inspired her to become an artist and take oil painting classes. But in 1986, she was working the streets. She had also just come out of a long-term relationship with John Rutan, and it seems she was none too pleased with his new wife. Investigators had focused on the possibility that the crime had been a robbery. Sherri Rae's car had been stolen. Discovered the silver BMW 2 miles from the couple's house 10 days after the murder. Because they had stacked stereo equipment next to the body, police fixated on the possibility of a botched robbery. Their hunch was reinforced by events that occurred just after the Rasmussen murder. A few days after the slaying, 2 men had robbed a woman at gunpoint. A few months after the murder, they held another unsuspecting woman at gunpoint after she walked into a break-in. Her house was just a few blocks from Rasmussen's house. They were described as Latinos between 5 feet, 4 inches, and 5 feet, 6 inches tall. They, therefore, emerged as the primary suspects in Rasmussen's death, but they were never found. Other than the car, the only other object taken from the scene should have given the investigators pause. The couple's marriage license was missing. Also undermining the random theft theory was the assailant's deep bite marks on Rasmussen's arm. If I can't have John, then nobody else will. After months of stalemate in the case, Rasmussen's parents began holding press conferences asking people to come forward with clues and offered a $10,000 reward. During the initial investigation, Lazarus was only a blip on the radar screen, despite repeated pleas from Rasmussen's father, Nuys Rasmussen, for the LAPD to consider that Rasmussen and Lazarus had both dated John Rutan and that Lazarus had turned up at the Glendale Adventist Hospital, where Rasmussen worked as a critical care nurse, and allegedly threatened her, "If I can't have John, nobody else will." Another confrontation had occurred a month before the murder, her father recounted. When Rasmussen had arrived home, she found Lazarus waiting for her inside. She was wearing her uniform. And just a few days before the murder, Lazarus had allegedly called Rasmussen and threatened her. Rasmussen had told her father that she thought the officer had been stalking her on the streets. At the time, she dismissed Mr. Rasmussen's allegations. "I told him to stop watching so much television. He wrote letters to the head of the police department at the time, Darrell F. Gates. His pleas for the department to take a second look at the case went unheeded, and, after 5 years, Mr. Rasmussen gave up. Mr. Rasmussen's reports had been dismissed as products of viewing too much crime fiction. But the discovery that led to the new charges against Lazarus would have been perfect for an episode of Law and Order. In February 2009, the Cold Case Squad, with time on its hands due to the dwindling number of murders in the area, reopened some additional old cases. Investigators ran DNA tests on all the old evidence, including the bite marks on Rasmussen's body. The DNA testing revealed that the suspect had to be a woman, disposing of the linkage to the other robberies. At the time of the initial investigation, Lazarus had been duly interviewed but never pursued as a likely suspect. The LAPD officers working the case were now faced with an uncomfortable prospect. A person who worked literally next door. Lazarus Department and the Cold Case Department were situated across the hall from each other, was now their prime suspect. After a day of following Lazarus around, they nabbed a discarded item with her saliva on it. It proved to be a match. On June 5, the announcement of the arrest of Stephanie Lazarus in the 23-year-old case sent shock waves through the press and the LAPD. She had been sitting in her third-floor office when told her that a suspect in custody in the jail might have information on one of her cases. She immediately left to check on the suspect. But, following policy, to get through jail security, she had to surrender her weapon. It was a trap. Once disarmed, the 49-year-old was arrested. The announcement stunned the police department. One veteran officer told the Los Angeles Times, "Never in my wildest imagination would I ever think she could do something like this. We drank beers. She was always quick to hug you or tell a joke." She described as bubbly and vivacious in a story about her private investigation firm, Unique Investigations, in the Ventura County Star in 2000. She was the type who made homemade soaps and chocolate-covered cherries to give her neighbors for Christmas. But other details about Lazarus began to appear on the internet. She was nicknamed Spaz, or Spazarus, for her erratic behavior when she became flustered or angry. Nels Rasmussen held a press conference the day of her court appearance and told the press corps what he'd been telling the Los Angeles Police Department all along. "The likeliest suspect is one of your own." He recounted for the Los Angeles Times the numerous attempts he had made to get the LAPD to take a closer look at the jealous ex-girlfriend of his daughter's husband. The Rasmussen family attorney said, "They provided information on the first day that there was a woman who was problematic." Taylor added that the family is extremely pleased and relieved with the arrest of Lazarus. After Lazarus's arrest, new details emerged. One key piece to the puzzle was missing. The gun used to shoot Rasmussen 3 times in the chest. The Los Angeles Times reported that Lazarus had called the Santa Monica Police Department a few weeks after the murder to report that her car had been broken into near the Santa Monica Pier. She reported a stolen gym bag, money, clothes, and her .38 caliber handgun. 23 years later, the break-in looks like a cover-up, and police now believe that she ditched the gun in the Pacific Ocean. The scene was more gruesome than originally revealed. Rasmussen's head had been bludgeoned. She had wounds on her wrists that indicated she'd been tied up. A robe laying on the floor nearby had bullet holes in them. It appeared the killer used it to muffle the shots. And the slaying might have been averted had a maid working in a nearby apartment who'd heard screams called the police. But she hadn't. Lazarus could have been apprehended even earlier. Proved the DNA to be a woman's in 2005, but the investigators hadn't realized that the original suspects were male at that time. When the case came up for re-review in February, they realized the mistake, and a secretive 4-month investigation was launched. On June 9, 2009, Stephanie Lazarus found herself on the wrong side of the law. She appeared in court in an orange jumpsuit, appearing distressed, her eyes wide open. Lazarus spoke just once, answering the judge about the continuance. "Yes, Your Honor." On March 9, 2012, Lazarus was found guilty of first-degree murder. During testimony heard before sentencing, John Rutan said, "The fact that Sherri's death occurred because she met and married me brings me to my knees." On May 11, Lazarus was sentenced to 27 years in prison, with credit for time already served. She will be eligible for parole in 22 years. May 11, 2012, former Los Angeles police det. Prosecutors said in a statement of views, filed in court that Lazarus misused her police training in the most profound way imaginable by utilizing that training and experience to commit murder and to cover up her crime. Lazarus betrayed the trust placed in her by the Los Angeles Police Department and by people of Los Angeles to pursue her own murderous ends. Lazarus' profound narcissism led her to kill and continues to motivate her denial of responsibility. Lazarus was convicted in March of first-degree murder in the death of Sherri Rae Rasmussen, who was shot 3 times in the chest in her Van Nuys home on February 24, 1986. Several months before the attack, Rasmussen, a hospital nursing director, had married John Rutan, who had also dated Lazarus casually for a few years before the wedding. Los Angeles County prosecutors had asked Superior Court Judge Robert J. Perry to sentence Lazarus to at least 27 years behind bars before being eligible for parole. The sentence came after emotionally charged statements from the friends and family of Rasmussen. The case garnered national attention for its sensational storyline of a lovelorn cop killing a woman she viewed as a romantic rival and then harboring the dark secret for decades. Adding to the drama, detectives ignored pleas by Rasmussen's father at the time of the killing to look at Lazarus as a possible suspect. Instead, investigators stuck to their early theory that unidentified Latino male suspects must have killed Rasmussen during a botched burglary. That theory eventually would be proven wrong by DNA in a saliva sample gathered from a bite mark on the victim's left forearm. But it would take a generation, a revolution in forensics technology, and a second LAPD investigation before Lazarus, who had become a respected art theft detective, officially emerged as the prime suspect in the case. Rasmussen family attorney John C. Taylor, who praised the work of current LAPD detectives, said in March that the family would address the handling of the original police investigation. The case against Lazarus came down to a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel and a broken heart, Deputy Dist. Addy. Shannon Presby said in his opening statement. Presby and co-counsel Paul Nuys sought to hammer home those points throughout the 5-week trial, in which more than 60 witnesses testified and presented 400 exhibits from the state and the defense. Defense attorney Mark Overland countered by repeatedly questioning the integrity of the DNA bite mark evidence, arguing that the vial stored it in was not properly sealed and ripped the envelope containing the sample. He also noted that a blood smear from an unidentified male was analyzed for DNA and did not match either the blood of Lazarus or Rasmussen, suggesting the possibility of another suspect. Overland tried to show his client was not the obsessed, jilted lover portrayed by prosecutors during cross-examination. In fact, Overland said, her former boyfriend Rutan continued to pursue Lazarus after becoming engaged. In the end, the DNA evidence proved too difficult to overcome. After little more than a day of deliberation, the panel of 8 women and 4 men found Lazarus guilty. Bite mark, DNA tie LAPD detective to 1986 murder. Now, correspondent Maureen Marr has the final judgment. The arrest of a cop was shocking news in the City of Angels. It wasn't just any cop. Stephanie Lazarus was a well-respected, highly decorated female detective with the Los Angeles Police Department. And it wasn't just a minor crime. She was charged with the murder of Sherri Rasmussen, a young nurse, 23 years after the killing. A Los Angeles police officer arrested for murder as just, it's a bombshell. I mean, you just don't get those kinda cases, Blankstein said. People were really stunned by this. Nobody saw this coming. Nobody says she was a cop that they saw on edge, Rubin explained. As far as we can tell, people in the department saw her as, you know, a cop's cop, a good cop. She's been a longtime patrol detective, Blankstein added. She was with the art theft detail in commercial crimes, which is theft of high-end art in LA, in doing those kinds of investigations. It gets a lot of press, a lot of attention. If the police and prosecutors are going to be believed, she's harboring a secret about murder for 23 years. At first glance, Ilene Lazarus has no obvious connection to the victim in this murder case, Sherri Rasmussen, a highly regarded nursing administrator. Sherri came from a very close-knit family. Her parents, Nuys and Loretta Rasmussen, adored their 3 daughters and their growing family. Sherri was the glue that held the family together all the time, and made everything that much better. Sherri's younger sister, Teresa, told 48 Hours mystery correspondent Maureen Marr. But in February 1986, Sherri would be attacked, beaten, and shot to death in her Los Angeles home. "We were an ordinary family, you know. You never think something like this is gonna happen to you," said Teresa. She says she could never have anticipated that only just now, more than 20 years after her sister's murder, there's been an arrest. "It doesn't make the pain any less," she said. "You start the grieving process all over again, one more time. The pain is most obvious when the family visits Sherri's grave. I don't believe that you can understand the grief. A part of your life has just been taken away forever," Nuys Rasmussen told Marr in an exclusive interview. Her parents say Sherri excelled at everything she did. She became a nurse when she was only 20. At age 27, she was named Director of Critical Care Nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, where she sometimes lectured. She liked taking care of people and making sure things were done right, that people were cared for properly, said Loretta Rasmussen. She said, "I'm gonna elevate the stature of nursing in the nation," Nuys recalled. And she was on her way. On top of a successful career, in early 1986, Sherri was thrilled, having just married the man she loved. Her new husband was John Rutan, a young engineer she'd met in 1984. As it would turn out, Rutan was the single link to the woman accused of murdering his new bride. That is because Ilene Lazarus was Rutan's ex-girlfriend. And according to Sherri's friends and family, Lazarus was not willing to give up the man she'd first met in college several years before the murder. Sherri was competition, Teresa said. If she could get Sherri out of the way, then possibly John would be free to be with her again. Rutan is the one who discovered his wife's body. He was in a daze, Teresa explained. He was sort of the deer in the headlights look, you know? John Rutan had little to say publicly after his wife's murder in 1986. He briefly addressed mourners at a hospital memorial service for Sherri, telling them, "I just want to thank you all for coming, and I want you to know that Sherri was the best professional in the world. She was the best wife that anybody could ever have. To me, he's kind of a central character that we really know the least about," said Blankstein. "There's a lot of questions left unanswered," added Rubin. Questions like, what did John Rutan know? Or suspect? He says that early on, he told detectives to talk to his ex-girlfriend, an LAPD cop. John is really the only person that has this connection to both women that can tell us what was going on to some extent. Marr asked Rubin. You would think, yeah. But police were off chasing other leads, and Sherri's friend, Jane Goldberg, says that Rutan just quietly faded out of sight, leaving her quite angry. I would have expected that John would have been much more involved in the investigation. And demand answers, she said. Especially as months, and then years, went by with no resolution to the case. He should have been her advocate. She would have been him, Goldberg said. Why wasn't he camped outside the police station? I don't understand it. In the winter of 1986, the dramatic spike in street crime was beginning to strain the Los Angeles Police Department called cops to investigate yet another killing. This time in a quiet, gated community in Van Nuys, the scene of Sherri Rasmussen's murder. There was a terrible struggle. She had been beaten badly about her face, and there was blood on the walls. The place was a mess, according to Joel Rubin, a Los Angeles Times police reporter who has been looking into how police investigated this case 25 years ago. The presumption, Rubin explained, is the attacker hit Sherri over the head, perhaps stunning her. which perhaps gave the attacker time enough to pull out the gun and shoot Sherri. Rubin learned that investigators back then wasted little time theorizing what had happened. The lead detective in the case very quickly hatched on the idea that Sherri Rasmussen had happened upon two men as they were trying to burglarize the house and that they killed her after being discovered. The crime scene includes two pieces of electronics equipment stacked at the foot of the stairs. And they pointed to that as indication this was a burglary gone bad, Rubin explained. A few weeks later, two men tried to commit a similar burglary in the area, and it bolstered their theory. Police even had sketches drawn of those two men, who they considered suspects in Sherri's murder. But there seemed to be little evidence that could tie anyone specifically to this crime. There were no witnesses and no gun. Even fingerprints they found led nowhere. But the Rasmussen family just wasn't buying any of it. It wasn't a robbery, Nels Rasmussen told Maureen Marr. They couldn't convince me of it. That's because Nels had his own idea about who was responsible for his daughter's killing. He didn't know her name at the time, just that she was his son-in-law's ex-girlfriend, an LA cop. She was his one suspect from day one of the murder because of a troubling story Sherri had told her father and some of her closest friends in the weeks leading up to her murder. She told me that John's ex-girlfriend had come to her office at the hospital, dressed provocatively, said Jane Goldberg. And confronted Sherri about John and said that if she couldn't have John, nobody could, Nels recalled. And she said if this marriage doesn't work out, I want you to know that I'll be waiting to pick up the pieces, Goldberg continued. At the time, I didn't realize how significant it was. Mark Overland, Stephanie Lazarus' attorney, says that never happened. Overland confirms that a confrontation did occur at the hospital, but he tells a completely different version of what his client said to Sherri. That you should tell John to leave me alone since you two are now engaged, he said. So she went to say your fiancé is pursuing me? But another one of Sherri's friends, Peggy Crabtree, who had worked in nursing with her, says Sherri told her about some alarming behavior by Stephanie Lazarus, who seemed to be showing up everywhere. John's ex-girlfriend kept appearing in places that Sherri would go. She couldn't go out to the store or go to the gym without having this woman show up, Crabtree explained. Sherri was clearly fearful and unhappy that she just couldn't get this person out of her life. To me, it would border on harassment, said Nels. When asked if Sherri thought there might have been something going on between John and Stephanie, Nels replied, she had a suspicion. Clearly, the message wasn't getting through that the behavior of his ex-girlfriend wasn't acceptable. And it was creating enough stress and unhappiness for Sherri that she was considering breaking up with John, said Crabtree. Even more unsettling, Nels said at one point, Sherri told him someone was following her in disguise. She said the person that was following her was dressed as a boy. That sounds like she thought the person was a woman, but had eyes that could penetrate you, and she said would make you think that they could see right through you. John Taylor, Rasmussen's attorney, says he has a pretty good idea of who Sherri was describing. It's very telling. One of the things that Sherri told her father is she believed she was being followed by somebody who had either crazy or wild-looking eyes, Taylor told Marr. Look at some of the photographs now of Stephanie Lazarus, and maybe it's not that far off. What's the timing on when the stalking incidents began for Sherri with Stephanie? Marr asked. I think immediately before they were married, and then after they were married, said Taylor. Lazarus' attorney calls the stalking charges nonsense and says that it never happened. More importantly, he claims it's doubtful that prosecutors can use any of the so-called stalking behavior that Sherri told her friends and father about against this decorated cop. Evidence of any prior contacts is not gonna come in at trial, Overland said. That's all hearsay. It's unreliable. That's why it's inadmissible. And you will be able to keep it out? Are you confident of that? Marr asked. Unless the judge makes an error, he replied. Do you believe that Stephanie was obsessed with John? Absolutely not, Overland said. Infatuated? Yes. Obsessed? No. For more than 2 decades, Nels Rasmussen has been on a frustrating quest to uncover the truth about his daughter's murder. But in 1986, he says he got nowhere trying to talk about it with Sherri's husband, John. "I was unable to get much out of John," he told Mar. "Do you think he was holding back on information? I have no idea what's going on in that boy's mind. In fact, he was holding back." Years later, John Ruetten would finally admit he had sex with Stephanie after becoming engaged to Sherri. "Did you think he was involved in Sherri's death in some way?" Mar asked Nels. "I do not believe that John had any involvement whatsoever," he replied. Apparently, neither do the police, who reportedly eliminated Ruetten as a suspect early on. But Nels Rasmussen says he tried, unsuccessfully, to get the lead detective to focus on John's ex-girlfriend. "That first week, the first 5 days, I mentioned it so many times that he kind of lost his cool with me, saying that there was no need to go there because there was nothing there," Nels recalled. Said Taylor, "He kept pressing them to follow up on what was a pronounced lead to him, eventually to the point where the investigating detective told him, 'You're watching too much TV. It's sloppy police work. It's negligent police work. It's incompetent police work.' Is it possible it was a cover-up?" Mar asked Taylor. His reply, "Yes. It was about 6 p.m. when Sherri Rasmussen's husband, John Ruetten, returned home from work." Los Angeles Times reporter Joel Rubin explains what happened next. He drives up to the townhouse. Her car is not there. He sees a broken glass that's shattered from the sliding door. He comes up the stairway, opens the door, and finds his wife's body on the floor. Sherri's found with 3 bullet wounds, 2 in the upper torso area, and then a third one to the abdomen area. Alan Tarski, Sherri's neighbor in 1986, spoke to John Ruetten just moments after he discovered Sherri's dead body. When he came in from the garage, her body was the very first thing that he saw, Tarski told Maureen Marr. His face was gaunt. He simply said, "Sherri's dead. She's dead." Shocked and curious, Tarski became an eyewitness. "I actually kind of snuck in while the police were still running in and out at the time. I saw the results of this disaster," he said. There were signs that obviously there had been a struggle because turned over chairs. The pool of blood that was in the living room was at probably 3 feet across at least. Although he was a close neighbor, living about 20 feet away, not a single detective ever questioned Tarski. He never knocked on his door to ask if he saw anything. "In all these years, I've never been contacted by police," he said. Police also never interviewed Sherri's sister, Teresa, who was among the last to see her alive. "I saw her the day before she died. They didn't even talk to me," she said. Detectives also failed to contact close friend Jane Goldberg. "The police never came to me. They never questioned me," she said. "Why aren't the police coming to me and saying, 'Do you know anybody who Sherri had a problem with?'" Sherri had confided in Goldberg about all the problems she was having with her husband's ex-girlfriend. "You know, that somebody recently came to her office and discussed her husband with her," Goldberg continued. "And then Sherri's murdered? It was the first thing I thought of." But investigators continued down the road of a botched burglary, even though the only missing items from Sherri's home were her car, which was a gift from John and, according to Goldberg, her marriage certificate. "And I thought, her marriage license and her car that she got when she was engaged? Those 2 things are gone. It's just so symbolic," said Goldberg. "When detectives did their walkthrough, there's nothing else in the house that's disturbed. So it raises questions about whether this was, in fact, a burglary," said Los Angeles Times police reporter Andrew Blankstein. Detectives stuck to that botched burglary theory even as the trail went cold for more than 2 decades. "You have to look back into the investigation to see if there's anything you missed. And in this case, it was Stephanie Lazarus," said Bert Looper, a retired detective who spent 27 years working for the Los Angeles Police Department. Now an investigator on Stephanie Lazarus' defense team, Even he believes she was an obvious suspect. She should have been looked at right away, Looper said. Who knows what would have come of that? We don't know. We'll never know because nobody did it. ... They should have looked at her if nothing else to eliminate her, and had they eliminated her, we probably wouldn't be here. As a result of not looking at her, we've lost valuable evidence that may have exonerated her, said defense attorney Mark Overland. But Stephanie Lazarus was an unlikely suspect. She was just a beat cop at the time but would be a star detective in her department. The UCLA graduate eventually married another detective. She had survived thyroid cancer and even raised money to start a daycare program for members of the LAPD, and eventually, she adopted her own little girl. Stephen Lazarus, Stephanie's younger brother, says there is absolutely no way his sister committed this brutal crime. When you know Stephanie and you know her devotion to law enforcement and her family and humanity, it doesn't make sense, nor do I believe it, he said. To the best of anyone's knowledge, was Stephanie ever looked at? Was she ever questioned? Marr asked reporter Joel Rubin. No, he says. The lead investigator at the time told me he never considered her a suspect. That detective, Lyle Mayer, spoke to reporters in 1986 about the burglars he suspected of the crime. He's retired now and reluctantly spoke to 48 Hours about that original investigation. Mayer emphatically denies nearly every point made by Sherri Rasmussen's family and friends. He refused to go on camera but told Marr that Nels Rasmussen never told him that Sherri was having a problem with John Rutan's ex-girlfriend. He also denies that John Rutan ever told LAPD to check into Stephanie Lazarus and flat-out denies any cover-up accusation. Said Rasmussen family attorney John Taylor, Lyle Mayer's got a lot of explaining to do. He absolutely claims John never brought up the name Stephanie Lazarus to LAPD. Never mentioned any of the altercations, Marr said to Taylor. Within 2 days of the murder, there was a crime scene walkthrough, and John Rutan gave Lyle Mayer, at least told him, you should look at my ex-girlfriend. And he identified her as being a Los Angeles police officer, said Taylor. So is Lyle Mayer lying? He has a selective memory, he said. Mayer does admit Stephanie's name came up during his investigation, but he says it was months after Sherri's murder, and he felt there was not sufficient reason to question her. As for Mayer's failure to interview critical witnesses, he firmly denies those accusations. He says he spoke to hundreds of witnesses and that he absolutely canvassed the neighborhood. Do you think that's true? I think that there would have been a paper trail that would reflect the hundreds of interviews, he replied. I think he's fabricating that. Whatever the shortcomings of the original investigation, forensic investigators did manage to collect one crucial piece of evidence: a saliva sample taken from a tiny bite mark on Sherri's arm. When they reopened the case, the saliva sample is sent out to a DNA lab for testing, Rubin said, and the DNA testing comes back as belonging to a woman. The DNA belonged to a woman. The results were mind-blowing and destroyed the theory that 2 male burglars killed Sherri. Rubin said, it led police to suspect one of their own. Stephanie Lazarus. 22 years had passed since Nels and Loretta Rasmussen's daughter, Sherri, had been brutally murdered. You never get over it, and such heartache and such pain, said Loretta. We thought that it was a lost cause, said Nels. Little did the Rasmussens know LAPD cold case investigators had quietly reopened Sherri's case and had found that the bite mark on her arm contained DNA of an unidentified female. In 2008, a detective called Nels with the news. I was ecstatic, Nels told Maureen Marr. I told Loretta, we're gonna get it solved. For the first time in 2 decades, Nels says a detective from the LAPD finally listened to him, that he believed an LAPD cop had murdered his daughter. He said, you know, if we get the DNA, and it doesn't match, we're back to base 1. And I say, you don't have to worry about that. You get the DNA, and you've got yourself an arrest. The new detectives immediately started trailing Det. Stephanie Lazarus. At the point, They find out that Stephanie Lazarus could be one of the suspects. Next step, they have to get a surreptitious DNA sample, reporter Andrew Blankstein explained. To get a sample of Stephanie's DNA, detectives secretly followed her to a local retail outlet, where she discarded a cup and a straw. Detectives then quickly collected the evidence and sent the samples to a lab. The results of the DNA test were stunning. The DNA from the bite mark pointed directly at Lazarus. The test indicated a 1.7 sextillion to 1 chance that the DNA belonged to someone other than Stephanie Lazarus. That's 17, followed by 20 zeros. It came back, and it was exactly who I'd been pointing to for 23 years, Nels said, getting emotional. I never felt so good in my life. As soon as the match, a team of more than a dozen LAPD officers secretly planned Lazarus' arrest. The question was, how are they gonna arrest an LAPD officer without tipping that officer off? Said Blankstein. It was a covert operation with an intense degree of risk. In fact, Lazarus worked directly across the hall from the detectives investigating her for murder. Reporter Joel Rubin describes it as an incredibly trying situation. The idea of arresting a cop for murder is a pretty dramatic event and doesn't happen very often, he said. While plotting Lazarus' arrest, detectives feared she might be wearing her service weapon. Rubin explains they came up with a plan to disarm her that began with a visit from a fellow detective. She is approached by a colleague who says, "Hey, I just got word that over the weekend, an arrest was made. This person is telling us that they have information about one of the cases that you're working." Within minutes, Lazarus made her way toward the jail, where she thought the suspect was waiting. If the detective were armed, she would have to remove her weapon before interviewing the suspect. She walks through the security point, at which point she's confronted by homicide detectives who say, "Stephanie, we need to talk to you," Blankstein explained. Unarmed and unaware that she is the suspect, Lazarus sits down in front of a hidden camera, still thinking the subject they need to talk about is art theft. But not for long. "Detective. Do you know John Rutan?" "Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah, I mean we dated, you know, what is this all about?" "Detective. Well, it's relating to his wife. Stephanie Lazarus." "Okay." "Detective. Did you know her?" "Stephanie Lazarus. Not really." "Detective. Did you ever meet her?" "Stephanie Lazarus. I don't know." "Detective. You dated John. How long did you guys date?" "Stephanie Lazarus. I mean, why are you guys? Is this something? I mean, you said it was gonna be an interview about art." "Stephanie Lazarus. I don't understand why you're talking about some guy the first dated a million years ago." "Detective. Well, do you know what happened to his wife?" "Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah. I know she got killed." Detectives continue to circle back to the subject of Sherri Rasmussen. "Detective. Had you ever met his wife?" "Detective. Well, one of the concerns I had, as we're looking at some of the notes, is, some of Sherri's friends said that you and she were having a problem, laughter, because of the John situation. And words were being exchanged, and it's all relating to John." "Stephanie Lazarus. You know what? I can't say." "Detective. You can't say?" "Stephanie Lazarus. No, that doesn't even ring a bell." Finally, an hour into the interrogation, detectives gets down to the tough questions. "Detective. Did you ever fight with her?" "Stephanie Lazarus. You mean like we fought?" "Detective. Did you ever duke it out with her?" "Stephanie Lazarus. No, I don't think so." "Detective. You'd remember that, right?" "Stephanie Lazarus. Yeah, I would think so. By now, there's no doubt about what's really going on." "Stephanie Lazarus. I mean, if you guys are claiming I'm a suspect, then you know I got a problem with that. I'm shocked. I'm really shocked that I blame somebody, saying that I did this. I mean, we had a fight, and so I went and killed her? I mean, come on." Detective Lazarus walks out only to be arrested and handcuffed. She was brought back to be read her Miranda rights. Those fateful words she knows all too well. On June 5, 2009, more than 2 decades after Sherri's death, Stephanie Lazarus was charged with the first-degree murder of Sherri Rae Rasmussen. But her defense attorney, Mark Overland, says the state's case against his client is no slam dunk. Asked if his client is innocent, Overland told Marr, "Absolutely. The bottom line is, this DNA evidence is flawed. It has been more than 2.5 decades since Rasmussen's daughter, Sherri, was shot dead. Finally, the woman accused of that murder is going on trial." Nels Rasmussen says he is 100% confident that Stephanie Lazarus killed his daughter. "Beyond a shadow of a doubt. This girl is guilty," he told Maureen Marr. Stephen Lazarus says people shouldn't be so quick to judge his sister. Lazarus is serving a 27-year-to-life sentence for the offense at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, California. Her case made national headlines. On February 24, 1986, Sherri Rasmussen, a critical care nurse, lived in a condominium with her new husband and Stephanie Lazarus' ex-boyfriend, John Rutan. That night, Rutan found his new wife beaten to death and shot numerous times with a .38 caliber revolver. The crime was initially deemed to be a robbery gone awry, as Rasmussen's BMW was stolen. The initial suspects were 2 Latino men believed to have committed other burglaries in Rasmussen's neighborhood. Lazarus was also a suspect in the initial investigation but was later cleared. Rasmussen's family still believed Lazarus was involved, as they had both dated Rutan, and Lazarus had once shown up at the Glendale Adventist Medical Center where Rasmussen worked and threatened her, supposedly stating, "If I can't have John, then nobody else will." In the meantime, Lazarus continued working with the Los Angeles Police Department. She started her own private investigation firm, Unique Investigations. 23 years after the murder of Sherri Rasmussen, the case was still unsolved. In February 2009, however, a cold case detective squad decided to re-investigate the case.